Thank you for joining us this evening for our Cumberland Family Academy workshop. Cumberland Family Academy is a Cumberland County Schools initiative. The Cumberland Family Academy is committed to enriching the lives of children by bringing parents, guardians, and schools closer together as equal partners. When families have high expectations for children and encourage them to work hard, they support and promote a child's academic, social, and emotional well-being. The purpose of the Family Academy program is to provide families with the necessary tools to support the success of their child's education. This evening, our workshop presenter is Donna White, Cumberland County Schools District Instructional Coach. Our topic for tonight is supporting the learning needs of kindergartners.
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to be with you all tonight. I am Donna White. I'm the district instructional coach, which means that I support the work of the instructional coaches in each of the elementary schools. I am also the district contact for the North Carolina Early Learning Inventory, which I will be sharing with you all this evening. I noticed in the chat box that we have a family from Howard Hall represented, and 34 years ago, I was starting my very first job as a second grade teacher at Howard Hall, and I have been with Cumberland County Schools now these entire 34 years. All right, without further ado, let's get started talking about my personal favorite group of students, and that would be our kindergartners. Tonight, we're going to talk about the North Carolina Early Learning Inventory and how NC ELI, as we call it, supports academic success. We're going to talk about the indicators that NC ELI assesses, as well as lots of fun activities that parents can do at home to support their kindergarten students. You know, when we think of kindergarten, we often think of kindergarten as the place where we go and we learn our ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. But kindergarten teachers will tell you that success in kindergarten requires much more than just learning the ABCs and the numbers. There are many aspects, such as a child's ability to follow directions, to ask for help when they need it, to manipulate counters and crayons and pencils, and to get along with their peers, to work together and to learn together collaboratively, as well as to solve problems. These are some of the things that the North Carolina Early Learning Inventory looks at. NC ELI is an observation tool that teachers use to formatively assess their students to know where they are at this point in time. NC ELI is focused on the whole child and their development, and the process is developmentally appropriate for our youngest students. NC ELI is used by teachers to plan for instruction, and NC ELI is also required by North Carolina state law. It's part of the Read to Achieve requirements. So let's talk about how ELI supports academic success for our kindergartners. First of all, it provides a snapshot of a child's early learning development in 5 key areas. It also gives teachers and families an understanding of a child's strengths as well as their needs. And it allows teachers and families to engage the child in learning experiences that support the child's progress. When we talk about the 5 areas of learning and development, teachers will look at language and development, cognitive mathematic development, approaches to learning, social emotional development, and physical development. With the ELI process, teachers observe and collect information about children during the first 60 days of kindergarten to create their child's profile. During this time, the kindergarten teachers observe and document what children say, do, make, or write during instruction and during routine times throughout the day. And when we talk about documentation, we're talking about teachers making notes about what they see their children doing and saying, as well as work samples, photographs, and even parent input is a source of information. With this information, teachers are then able to determine where on a continuum that outlines the developmental pathway that kindergarten children follow. These progressions are color-coded, and they cover the time frame from birth to third grade. And so to give you an example of what this might look like, let's think about when our young children started the process of learning to walk. And we know that early on, the walking process starts when children start lifting up their head and supporting their upper body. And then they gradually learn how to sit up and to crawl, and then to pull themselves up and hold on and walk a little bit. And then that wonderful day comes when they let go and begin walking. And we know that some children go through that development at different rates. Some children, it seems, will spend a lot of time with crawling before they ever take the leap into walking. Other children seem to crawl very little and then go immediately into walking. But it is a progression that is a widely held expectation that children will follow from the very earliest stages until they are able to actually walk and then run and skip, etc. This is what the progressions in NC ELI are also like. Based on where each child is along these progressions, then the kindergarten teacher is able to select activities that will support the child's learning and development, no matter where they are along that progression. With NC ELI, we're looking at those 5 areas of learning and development that I mentioned. And within those, there are 14 skills that are assessed. During the first 30 days, the skills in language and literacy and the mathematics are observed, and a preliminary rating is determined. As we get to the 60th day of kindergarten, then all 14 skills have been observed, and a rating for each of those is finalized. The platform itself that teachers use is available beyond day 60, and teachers are encouraged to continue to use it to support the development and learning of students, even though after day 60, there are no further requirements with NC ELI. So let's talk a little bit more about the specific skills that are assessed. The language area is important for the development of early language and early literacy skills. Adults who build nurturing relationships by paying close attention to what children are trying to communicate and who respond consistently to children's communication help children become good communicators. With NC Eli, we look at two aspects of language. We look at the child's ability to follow directions and to tell about another time or place. We also know that literacy learning begins at birth. During the early childhood years, children engage in the development of reading and writing behaviors that form the foundation for early literacy. Development in this area is key as children apply knowledge of print, phonics, rhyme, and retelling of familiar stories. NC Eli specifically looks at whether the child is noticing rhyme and alliteration. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that might look like at home. When we talk about following directions, that's one of the language skills that's assessed. I'd like you to think back to when your kindergartner was a very, very young child. And do you remember that day when you said, wave to mama, wave bye-bye, wave to grandma, and your child actually took their hand and waved it? That's where following directions begins. When we're looking at a kindergartner, we're looking at moving towards following 2 or 3 step directions. So we've moved from a simple, wave grandma goodbye to take the fish food off the shelf, put the food in the fish bowl, put the lid back on the jar, and place the fish food back on the shelf. Multiple step directions. As I said, we don't expect multiple step directions though until towards the end of kindergarten. We also talk about with the language, that ability to tell a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the other aspect of language that we look at is, can the child tell about an event, something that happened in the past or in a different place, and they're able to give you a lot of details about what that event was. So the following directions and telling a story and telling an event are all part of the language skills that are assessed. Let's talk about some of the literacy skills. I mentioned the aspects of rhyme and alliteration. With our kindergartners, when they were very young, they would complete sentences with rhyming words. So for example, if I said 1, 2, buckle my, and the younger child would finish that with the word shoe. But as we move into kindergarten, we're looking for, can the child tell us that if 2 words rhyme? So for example, I might say cat hat, does that rhyme? Cat kitten, does that rhyme? And of course it doesn't. We move from simply asking the child if 2 words rhyme into giving the child a word and asking the child to give us a rhyming word. So if I said the word ball, what's a word that rhymes with ball? The other literacy skill that's developed is alliteration. And that's when a child can tell you if 2 words start the same. So if I say Matt and Mike, those words begin the same. We also move to matching the beginning sound with other words. So for example, if I say, Can the child give me words, other words that start with the sound? Let's talk about mathematics. The mathematics area supports the cognitive development of thinking skills. And this happens through problem solving and reasoning and communicating about the reasoning, making connections. This is how kids learn math. In fact, many of you with kindergartners have probably started hearing a wonderful math word called Succes. Your kindergartner may be coming home and saying, oh, I Succes today. Succes is a very fancy mathematic word for that ability to look at a quantity and say how many there are without counting, actually counting. So for example, if I hold up my fingers like this, I'm sure you immediately said 4 fingers, but you did not have to count 1, 2, 3, 4. Think back to when your child was much younger. How many times did they have to count and recount and count again? But with much practice with seeing different quantities, children are able to Succes. They become supervisors in that they are able to know how many fingers someone's holding up. This also works when children are playing games with dice. You know, you learn what the 3 dots look like or pips look like. And so that is what the mathematics looks like. In kindergarten, not only are our children counting numbers, so in other words, they count to 20, count to 100, however high they go, depending on where they fall on that progression, but they're able to simply rote count. Then they learn quantities. In other words, they can actually count out 10 objects or count out 12 objects. And then finally, they get to the point where they're able to connect numbers or numerals, the actual number itself. As in this example, the number 3, the numeral 3, with the quantity. So we have 3 ducks, and this is the symbol that we use to represent those 3 ducks. What can all of this look like at home? Just a lot of counting, having our children count to 20 rotely and then count 10 to 20 objects correctly. We also want to do things like have them tell us what number comes next. So for example, if I say 8, what is the next number? We want our children to be able to make sets of 6 to 10 objects and describe the parts. And by that, think about if you have a domino, how you have the 2 ends and you may have 4 little dots on one and 3 on the other, and together that makes 7. So they're making sets and describing the parts. And then figuring out which part is more and which part is less and which part is the same. And then finally, being able to recognize the actual numeral, the number, the written number, and connect it to the corresponding amount of objects. And we start that with actual objects, with counters, and I always have plenty of counters myself, just using the lids from water bottles, but just simply taking these counters and having a handful of them, counting them out, and then identifying the numeral that also matches that number of objects. Those progressions that we just talked about are the ones that are looked at during the first 30 days of school. And as I said, the teacher determines a preliminary rating. In other words, this is where the child is at this point in time. And then beyond, as we get closer to 60 days, that position on that progression may have changed, and the teacher is able to make that adjustment as the children continue to learn and grow. So let's talk about the indicators that are assessed before the end of that 60-day period. One area that we look at is the child's approaches to learning. In other words, how are they able to acquire and organize and use information in complex ways? A lot of the child's development in this area has been impacted by simply the playing that the child has done and continues to do even into kindergarten. Play is such a critical part of that cognitive development. So let's talk about what approaches to learning might look like at home. I'm sure many of us can share stories about our child as they were younger, and it seemed like they could never focus on one thing at a time. It was from one thing to another thing to another thing. And as children grow, they become able to maintain attention to an activity for a little bit longer. And with kindergartners, we like to see a child moving into that 5 to 10 minute of sustained attention to an activity. We also look at, is the child able to continue an activity without being distracted? And can the child go back to an activity after a brief interruption? That is a very challenging skill for children to develop, because when they do learn to focus, they stay so focused that sometimes that distraction gets them completely off task. We also want our children to eventually move to the point where they can start a project and then come back to it after a few days. Again, that's how the children's attention moves and their approach to learning moves along that progression. Okay, let's talk about social emotional development. This area addresses how children feel about themselves, their relationships with others, and how they learn to manage and express emotions. The development of positive emotional and social skills forms the basis for positive development in all of our other skill levels. So let's talk about what that will look like at home. When we think about children managing their feelings, we're looking at how children are able to express themselves as they interact with each other. Oftentimes, you can notice when your child uses an acceptable strategy for managing her own feelings. For example, when two children are playing and one child takes the toy truck that the child was playing with and just takes it away. And your child says to the person who took her truck, "That's my truck and I'm playing with it." Or when you see your child kicking her legs because she's struggling to put on her shoes, you can give your child the words. "I know it's frustrating when those shoes won't go on. You can always ask me for help when you get stuck." Whenever your child needs assistance in this way and you are giving the child the words, that helps them grow and their ability to talk about solutions and solve problems. When we talk about following rules and expectations, at home, I'm sure many of you have a chore chart or a chart for when your child completes certain tasks, maybe when they clean up their room. Those are great ways to help children develop the skills they need to follow rules and expectations. The game Follow the Leader is a great activity to play that again reinforces following the rules and expectations. When you think about rules, I think we often think about following the rules at home, at school, but we have rules at home as well. When children can see that connection between at school, we have our school rules, and at home, we have our home rules, it helps them with that aspect of following limits and expectations. So just like in a kindergarten classroom, you're very likely to see their class rules or class norms, as we sometimes call it, posted. And you might consider making a rule chart at home for your kindergartner to share. When we talk about or think about children responding to emotional cues and solving problems, we know that it is very hard for them to think abstractly. And oftentimes our children don't understand their own feelings or the feelings of others. This is why we want to encourage our children to describe how they're thinking, how they're feeling. And even when we are sharing storybooks or pictures or photographs, asking our children to tell us, how do you think that person feels? So that they can learn to recognize the facial cues, etc. When we think about interacting with peers, how is that child solving? How does our child solve problems? How do they do things like take turns? How do they look out for other children? Oftentimes when you're in the classroom, you will experience a time when one student will call to your attention that there's another student who is struggling or who may not understand something. And it always is such a wonderful feeling when you see that level of empathy in our young children. Sharing, taking turns, looking out for themselves and for other children are all ways that social and emotional development is taking place. When we have our child take care of their own personal belongings, that's another way that we reinforce that responsibility, following limits, following expectations. So let's talk about the physical aspects of NC ELI. NC ELI specifically measures one aspect of physical development, but we know that children develop not only their large muscle, but also their fine motor skills with their small muscles. NC ELI focuses on using fingers and hands. In other words, how is the child able to hold things like pencils and crayons and the tools that we use? So what does that look like at home? It looks like have the child holding the pencils and crayons correctly. when you watch your child, you can see them moving along the spectrum as they go from holding the crayons at different angles and with different fingers, and then how eventually they learn to have that pencil grasp that is what's necessary for writing, for example. When children are able to tie shoes and zip up their coats, and it's about coat season now, buttoning their shirts and their sweaters, and that can also be a way to develop the those fine motor skills. Moving and manipulating small objects, building things using building blocks, and those are making those structures also give the child the experience they need to move along the progression as measured by NCEI. Well, I have talked a lot, and I am sure that there are lots of questions that you may have. And so let me pause here and see what questions we have.
There is a question in the chat. What is the best way to approach better reading without overwhelming a 5-year-old? We are reading every day. We do write and spell out the words. However, there are times that I know she knows the words, but is nervous about saying it because she doesn't want to be wrong. I tell her it's okay to try and be wrong, but it doesn't always work. Sometimes we do read longer than 20 minutes, then the 20 minutes recommended time for her homework assignments. Could that be the issue? We are also reading 7 days a week, meaning I still at least try to read with her on the weekends.
Okay, let's see if we can break that down. Thank you so much. You bring up a lot of interesting points about a 5-year-old. And one is, what's the best approach to take with reading without overwhelming a 5-year-old? And you essentially have answered your question in that you're reading every day. It's part of your routine. It's just the thing you do. Having that reading routine, whether it's reading after dinner, before bed, first thing in the morning, whatever the routine is, that is a great strategy. So I encourage you to continue that. And you indicate that you're writing and spelling out words, but there are times when you know the child knows the word, but for whatever reason, she seems to be nervous about saying the word because, she doesn't want to be wrong, and that's understandable. One thing you might consider is letting her target a few of those words, and by a few, I'm talking 3 to 5 words that she's encountering that she's not sure of. And to have those words handy, taped on the refrigerator or somewhere where she can see them often and refer to them, just to boost her confidence. The confidence will come with the practice. It's kind of a circle because she'll become more confident as she practices more. And then the more she practices, the more confident that she becomes. But you're doing exactly the right thing, because we all encounter words that we don't know. And that is how we learn and grow. So you are doing the right thing in telling her that it's okay to be wrong. But I think coming up with a system or some things that you can do that can just boost that confidence as she encounters the word more frequently. And sometimes you do read longer than the 20 minutes. And that's okay as long as she's engaged in that process. Oftentimes with kindergartners, in order to, for example, finish a book, and they do love to finish the book, sometimes that means I read part and the child reads part, and then I read a little bit more, and trading that off as well. I think if she's reading at 20 minutes at a time, I think that is really good for a kindergartner. You know, we said maintaining that 5 to 10 minutes of attention is good. So anything beyond 5 to 10 minutes at a time is good. Oftentimes when we recommend reading for 20 minutes, it doesn't necessarily have to be 20 minutes continuously. It could be 10 minutes now and 10 minutes later, to break that up as well. But great job reading on the weekend and so forth.
We have a comment that a parent focuses on 5 words a week and mixes them up to make sentences. The son thinks it's fun to make silly sentences.
What a great tip. Everybody steal that one. Absolutely. Mixing, having those 5 words that you focus on. And I am sure once they make up those silly sentences, they will never forget those words. So thank you for sharing that tip as well. Anything else?
Just a thank you in the chat. There does not appear to be any more questions at this time.
Okay, so before I end, I do want to impress upon parents the importance of being in contact with your child's teacher. Right now, your child's teacher is wrapping up the first 30 days of assessing with NC Eli. Reach out to your child's teacher and ask them, what did you learn? Your child's teacher, as well as your child's principal, is first and foremost the go-to expert on what your child knows and is able to do when they're in the school environment. And I must say, please understand that oftentimes a child will do more at home, and your child's teacher may not see it at school, but you can share your observation of what your child is able to do with that child's teacher, so that that teacher has that complete understanding of what your child knows and is able to do. The North Carolina Office of Early Learning has a lot of resources on its website regarding NC Eli, also with activities to support your child in kindergarten. And if some of you have children who will be kindergartners, they also have some documents there of activities and tips so that you can prepare your child as they begin kindergarten for next year. So that is the North Carolina Office of Early Learning. And as I said, if you can just Google that, and lots of good resources are available.